Hello everyone, this is Vladislav, developer of Lazy 3D Blender add-ons. Today, I'll walk you through how to use the Fauna Master Pro add-on. Before getting started, please make sure to install it. The installation process is explained in the Documentation tab on SuperHive or at the beginning of the PDF manual included in the download files. Once you've installed the product, come back to this video. Now that you've installed it, whether in a custom location or directly into Blender, it doesn't matter. In the sidebar, you'll now see the Fauna Master Pro panel. It contains 3 subpanels: Import, Settings, and Bakery. Import lets you add assets, Settings allows you to customize their parameters, and Bakery handles baking for faster performance. Let's start with the generators, beginning with birds. The Flux system spawns birds along a curve. Choose any asset and click Import. You'll automatically enter Draw mode, where you can create the curve that defines their flight path. The position of the curve is based on the 3D cursor. This asset is ideal for creating flocks flying across the sky. They don't require baking and run faster.
Let's draw a curve now. We've drawn the curve, and we can make it larger so the flight paths become much longer. Great.
The arrow shows the flight direction. And if you need a closed path, just press Close Curve to loop it.
All of these settings can be found in the documentation. By clicking the Open Documentation button, the manual will open. In my case, it opens on the last page because I had scrolled through it earlier, but you can use the table of contents to jump directly to the section you need. Everything is explained in detail there, so to save time in this video, I won't go over every single setting. I'll just mention one important thing. For optimization, all assets use the same offset animation. To make the animation more varied, simply duplicate the generator and set the animation offset between 1 and 3. For example, setting it to 2 will add more randomness to the animation. This will help mix up the animations being used and create a more natural effect.
Next, simulation generators. Unlike Flux, these use simulation nodes. Here, animation must be baked, but they are more dynamic. They support targets, collisions, and more.
Important. Before adding a generator to anything, you must assign a ground collection. The ground collection defines the objects that birds can walk on and where they can spawn. This setting is especially crucial for assets that move on the ground, such as walking birds. Keep in mind that the generator itself must always be placed outside of this collection, otherwise the effect will break.
For example, when importing a crow, the birds will appear inside an ecosphere collection. You can control whether they spawn on the ground or in the air. You can also create only walking birds by setting flying birds' density to 0. And you can enable ground avoidance for flying birds. If enabled, they will avoid objects placed in ground collection. There's also a fast mode to preview flight paths quickly in the viewport.
For detailed settings of flying birds and birds on ground, I won't go into them in this video to keep it shorter. All of these options are fully explained in the documentation. I'll just mention one thing. Let's hide the flying birds for now, reduce their number, and disable the ground ones. There's a parameter called Flying Birds Path Scale. The larger the value, the farther they will fly from the center. The smaller it is, the closer they will stay to the center. On the ground, the same principle applies with walking path scale. For performance reasons, you can temporarily hide the flying birds. If you enable gravity, they will fall. The Delete on Walls option ensures they won't spawn on walls. If your ground surface has uneven areas or ledges, like in this example, you need to add collisions for those parts. In the Simulation Rules panel, add an obstacle, a cube will be created automatically. You can replace it with any model you want. I included primitives for quick use. Place the obstacle where needed, and the birds will stop climbing onto it.
If all creatures have stopped moving, just touch any of the sliders and Blender will update behavior.
Just fine-tune the settings slightly and they'll avoid it. The same approach works for flying birds as well. All simulation rules are documented in detail, so I won't cover them here. If requested, I can create a separate video focused on them. Finally, note that you can adjust animation speed.
Now let's move on to idle birds. This is a very simple generator. You just select the mesh where they will spawn. It needs to be selected. Click Add and draw a line where the birds will perch. They have a basic idle animation, and you can adjust their density. You can also close the curve, just like in Flux. To make the animation more varied, reduce the probability and add another generator. Select a ground mesh, click Add, draw another curve, and then adjust the instance animation offset with negative values to create random offsets. Next is the insects category. There are two types of generators here, simulation and clamp. The clamp option quickly spawns swarms without advanced collisions or targets. It works very simply. The generator spawns at the 3D cursor. Select it, tweak the settings, and scale it up to see better. The insects fly along random paths within a domain radius, which you can visualize by increasing density. This is perfect for adding quick background insects without much setup. Now, simulation. Some insects have both flying and crawling variations, like flies. When you import them, you assign a ground collection and an ecosphere is created. You can have multiple ecospheres, each spawning its own group. The panel lets you choose the mode, only crawling, only flying, or a combined setup. Depending on the mode, you'll see different settings. Common parameters include density, size, seed, and a fast preview mode. Flying insects can also avoid the ground if you assign a ground collection. You can adjust their path scale, spawn them per frame, or enable continuous spawning, which defines how many percent per second will appear. Just like with birds, you can also prevent them from spawning on walls. Density multipliers allow you to control crawling and flying insects separately for more flexibility. Press Locker button and additional density settings will appear. Simulation rules are divided into two sets. The top 5 apply to both asset types, while the bottom 4 are only for crawling insects. Everything is explained in detail in the documentation. One important note, don't forget to bake your effects. You can do this in the Bake panel, where all your Fauna assets will appear. You can either select the assets or bake them. Baking takes some time and runs from the first frame to the last. Here, you can adjust the frame range, and you also have the option to clear the cache. Alternatively, you can select the generator, go to Physics, and bake it there. All right, that wraps up the insects. Now, let's move on to land animals. They're divided into run, walk, and idle. Idle works the same way as with birds. Choose an asset, select the ground, and spawn them. Offset animations work the same way as well. The main focus is on run and walk. These are separate states for movement, since in geometry nodes we can't dynamically change speed or animation type. Splitting them saves time and improves performance. For example, let's take a fox. With the ground selected, click Import. The script automatically switches you to Edit mode, where you draw a spawn zone. The cubes show you the boundaries of the zone. The animals will then appear inside. You can adjust their animation speed, faster or slower, as well as tweak walking motion amplitude for more realistic movement. They will respect ground and wall collisions. Just like with insects, you also have base controls like size, seed, and fast preview mode to save FPS. Let's learn about spawn modes.
In the Spawn Settings tab, you'll find all the available spawning modes. By default, the Draw spawner is active. You can click Edit Zone, and it will automatically select and take you to the zone. From there, you can draw, delete, or create a new one, and adjust the density. If you don't want to use this mode, disable it, and the simple spawner will become active. This works inside a cubic domain, where you can adjust the size, and all animals will spawn inside the cube. Another option is Endless Spawner. Here, you need to create a collection that serves as the spawn container. For example, if you choose a cylinder, animals will spawn endlessly inside it. You can fine-tune the width and density as needed. There's also Spawn on All Ground, which lets you use a weight map.
Enable weight paint spawning.
Set a name for vertex move.
Now, select your ground object. Create a vertex group with the same name, switch to weight paint mode, and paint the density distribution. For simplicity, let's stick with the simple spawner. When enabled, you'll also see options for spawning across the entire ground. Now, with our fox example, once the spawning setup is done, this panel also contains motion and speed controls. Just like birds have a flight path scale, land animals use walking motion amplitude. A small value means they'll cluster in one spot. A larger value makes them run around more realistically. In the physics section, you can enable experimental gravity. Simulation rules work the same way as with birds and insects. I recommend enabling self-collision to prevent overlaps. By enabling Show Bounds, you can visualize the collision radius. Larger radii cause stronger separation. You can also set the number of iterations. More iterations give smoother but slower processing. Fewer iterations are faster but less smooth. For example, with 3,000 iterations, set the strength to around 0.23.
Bigger iteration amount will make creatures' reflections more smoother.
You can also adjust animation speed. Animations are randomized by default, so there's no need to manually set offsets.
Now let's learn how to use fish. Fish have only one type of generator, and that is simulation. To use it, choose any preset and add it to the scene with the 3D cursor. Click Import and the generator will appear. The fish will spawn inside a sphere. To create multiple spawn areas, select the generator object, switch to Edit mode, and either add a new primitive, such as a cube, or duplicate the original sphere. This way, fish will spawn in several locations. Fish also have an LOD setting, ranging from level 1 to 3, as well as a fast mode. Physics parameters work the same as with other generators. The motion amplitude defines the length of their paths. A unique feature for fish is the wave system, which controls their body bends. If you disable it, the fish won't undulate realistically, but scene performance will improve. When enabled, additional controls appear: wave speed, wave frequency, and scale, which define the wave texture. You can also enable Effect Wave Speed by Fish Speed, so that the wave frequency depends on how fast the fish move. The faster they swim, the stronger the wave effect. Another option is the velocity multiplier, which increases the wave amplitude without changing speed. This is useful for creatures like tadpoles. Other than that, the settings are identical to those of other generators.
Now I'll tell you about waterline avoidance. First, create a plane that will represent the water surface. Next, select a fish, and in the settings, enable water surface avoidance.
After that, two options will appear: selecting the object and adjusting the force. Use the eyedropper to pick the water surface object and then adjust the force. Now the fish will no longer cross the water surface, but will try to stay beneath it. You can increase the force so they avoid the surface more strongly. For example, if you set the force to 2, the fish will essentially fear approaching the surface. However, don't set the value too high or they will always swim downward. The optimal setting is up to 1. A good value is around 0.1 to 0.2. Now let's go over simulation rules, which include various settings for the physics of insects, animals, fish, and birds. These apply specifically to simulation assets. There are several types of forces: collision, evasion, goal, attraction, curve follow, obstacle, scared, jumping, and self-collision. For the video, I chose insects because they are the only asset type where we can immediately look at all the forces at once. For example, birds don't have jumping or scared. So we'll use flies as the example, since there are both flying and crawling assets in that group. In principle, all of these forces work the same way across all types of simulation assets. Let's start with obstacle and evasion. These forces have the same structure and the same concept. The only differences are in the parameters. They are built exactly the same way, and if you set identical values in both, they will behave identically. Evasion is designed so that the insects try to keep as far away as possible. Obstacle, by default, makes insects stop when colliding and hover close to the obstacle. Let's create an icosphere and use it as an example. Give it an orange color so it's visible. Create a new collection, name it Evasion, and put the sphere inside. Now select our modifier and insert the collection there. If you see the insects freezing in place, disable any active forces that are connected to empty collections. It's important to disable any forces that have empty collections assigned. If a collection is empty and the force is enabled, the particles don't know what they should be avoiding, and they just stay in place. Back to evasion. You'll see that they start avoiding the object. You can increase their speed and motion amplitude so they avoid it more actively. Adjusting parameters like distance makes them react earlier. Speed controls how fast they pull away. More detailed explanations can be found in the documentation. Here, I'm just covering the basics. The scared force works on the same mechanism, except the insects flee much further. It also has a vision distance setting, so they can detect obstacles from far away and avoid them. Now let's also look at obstacle. Assign the same collection, and you'll see the insects collide with the walls and slowly move around them. If we now set the same parameters as evasion, they will essentially behave like evasion. There's an issue if the collection contains multiple objects placed very close to each other. You may see strange effects. Why does this happen? Because collisions are calculated using raycast. Each face casts a ray of a certain length. When two objects face each other, their raycasts push the particles in conflicting ways, which produces this effect. This is why I separated evasion, obstacle, and scared into different forces. One solution is to use evasion on one side and obstacle on the other. For example, create a second sphere, place it in a new collection named obstacle, enable evasion, and assign your obstacle collection. Now the issue is solved. Please keep this in mind. You can also find more information about this in the documentation under the FAQ section.
Now let's cover collision. Collision is the classic method. It's the most stable and also fairly simplified. The simulation is straightforward, fast, and comes with just a single setting, collision width. It works very simply. When the insects approach an object, they avoid it. If you add a second object into the collection, you'll see the effect right away.
You can also combine collision with other forces to solve issues, such as using it together with evasion, obstacle. Important note: if you're working with a high poly mesh, you need to at least apply a decimate modifier so that the shape is simpler. This way, the insects can understand the outline better. For example, let's take this stone I downloaded from BlenderKit. Author is James Middleton. As you can see, it has very complex geometry. Because of that, collision may be calculated incorrectly or chaotically, and performance will also suffer. The same applies to evasion. To solve this, either apply a decimate modifier or use simple primitives. For instance, you can add a primitive icosphere. Here's how. Select the fly. Add an icosphere. Place it in the collision collection. The icosphere will not render in the final scene. In the viewport, it will display only as a wireframe. Just adjust its size to match the shape you want. This works much faster because the flies spawn inside the scene and are repelled properly by the simpler collider. Adjust placement slightly, and now everything works perfectly.
Now let's move on to goal. We'll also look at attraction at the same time. First, the 3D cursor. When you click this button, an empty object with a goal is created. The insects will follow this empty, trying to get closer to it. The speed parameter controls how quickly they approach. For more realism, it's better to set some variation so they don't all approach in a perfect circle, but rather in a more natural pattern. The greater the difference in delay values, the more organic the movement will look. This works the same way for flying assets as well as crawling ones. Both will move toward the goal. The difference between goal and attraction is that with goal, they move toward it regardless of whether they see it or not. With attraction, the attractor has to appear within their range of influence. The attractor is useful, for example, if you want to simulate moths circling around a light. With goal, once they reach the point, they'll just circle it, which is good for keeping them moving continuously. Also, the further the target empty is, the faster they will try to move toward it. Now about attraction. Its mechanism is essentially the same as evasion and obstacle. The only difference is in the parameters. Instead of repelling, they are pulled toward the object. Let's assign a collection, and you'll see that they begin to approach it. The same problem can occur as with collision. If multiple objects are very close to each other, ray casts can conflict. That's why I recommend placing attractors only on one side, ideally using a single attractor. I'll think about possible improvements for this in a future update. If you'd like to see it added, please let me know on Superhive. Now the settings. Force determines how strongly they are pulled. Vision range sets how far away they can detect the attractor. Min distance defines how close they'll try to get. For example, set vision range to 12 and they will spot the attractor from a further away and move toward it. If flying insects aren't moving well toward it, that's likely because their speed is too low. Increase their speed so they fly toward it faster. Attraction depends on the point speed, so you can push it closer to 1. With that, they'll move closer while flying insects will tend to hover a little farther away. That's logical because if they get too close, they just collide. You can also disable crawling assets and adjust separately. If you want to combine with different simulations, I recommend creating 2 assets, one only for flying and another only for crawling. As you can see, they now stay near the attractor and hover around it. Now let's talk about jumping. Jumping is simple to use. Just click Enable, and some of the particles will start jumping. You can set Count, how many of them will jump, Duration, how long they'll keep jumping, which also affects their speed, Rate, how far they will jump, Elevation, the height of the jumps, and Variation, randomness of the jump height.
This is useful for creatures like grasshoppers or frogs. Now let's look at curve follow. The idea here is that particles will follow a curve. You can either assign an existing curve or click the button to draw a new curve directly. The curve will automatically snap to a surface if you draw it there. For example, we can draw one like this, and it works perfectly. Two key settings: curve distance, how close they stay to the curve, and magnet distance, how far away they can see and be pulled toward the curve. If the magnet distance is small, they'll only notice the curve when they're very close, making it harder for them to stick to it. If you set it to 3 and keep curve distance small, they'll stay close to the curve. If you increase curve distance, they'll follow it from farther away. For example, with curve distance at 3, they'll spread further from the curve. If it's below 0.1, they'll stick tightly to it. You'll see them move narrowly along the curve. Magnet distance works similarly. At low values, they don't notice the curve until they're very close. At higher values, they detect it from further away. For instance, at 17, they'll begin to move toward it earlier. Move in curve direction, if enabled, they'll move along the direction of the curve. You can check the curve's direction by going into Edit mode, enabling normals, and viewing the arrows that show which way the curve flows. If this is disabled, they'll just move closer to the curve without following its flow. You can also combine curve follow with other forces. For example, set curve distance to 3 and 1, then add collision. Now, as they approach, they will avoid obstacles while still following the curve. This works better with evasion or obstacle for more stability. Flying assets work with curves too. If you disable flying ones, the crawling ones still follow the curve. Just tweak the settings, especially speed, for the behavior you want.
Here's a quick demonstration. Here is a curve, and here are the flying insects that approach it and then move along it. If they're moving too slowly, simply increase their flight speed. If you want them to move evenly along the curve path, disable hover movement. That way you won't see the kind of stuttering behavior we noticed earlier. When hovering is enabled, they move in a stop-and-go fashion. With it disabled, they fly smoothly along the curve.
Thank you for watching. For any questions, please reach out on Superhive. I usually reply within about 15 minutes if I'm online, and within an hour on weekends.